be joining as we go. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Jordan Street. For those of you who don't know me, I work with Safe World. I'll be moderating today's session, and we will hear today from 5 great speakers that have lots of experience and things to reflect on UN counterterrorism efforts from a range of different perspectives. So before we go to each one of these speakers, I'm just going to give a very quick biography of each one. Sorry to have to do this. I know this is the boring bit that none of us like. But just so you know who's speaking. So first we have Professor Fionnuala Ní Uaillinn, who is the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. She is the Faculty Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School and has held numerous positions relating to peace, human rights, humanitarianism, gender equality, and rule of law in her long career. Then we have Mr. Mark Batak, who manages the programs of the Initiatives for International Dialogue, which is a Philippine-based regional peace building and advocacy institution working for inclusive peace processes in Southeast Asia. We also have with us Lorraine de Grussen, who is the young leader from France. She steers the United Network of Young Peace Builders, which is a global network of 100 youth-led local organizations building peace in over 50 countries. We are also joined by Ottilia Anna Mangadis, who is the head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies, working to promote human security in Africa. And then finally, we have Mr. Ali Altiok, who is the Youth Peace and Security Officer at Interpeace, which is a global peace-building organization working in 20 different countries. So before I turn to Fionnuala, I just wanted to quickly frame why we're having this conversation today. So since the World Trade Center attacks in September 2011, we've seen states invest extraordinary political, financial, and military resources to wage a global war on terror. We've seen in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq at least 480,000 people that have been directly killed as a result of these wars. Half of these deaths were civilians. We saw the recent report from Brown University's Cost of War project that an estimated 37 million civilians have been displaced since the war on terror began. Add to these figures the impact of counterterrorism approaches in destabilizing and fueling devastating and protracted wars in Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Libya, violence in Nigeria and the Philippines, efforts to stabilize Mali and neighboring countries in the Sahel, and the true costs of the unending war on terror are extraordinary. While the UN did not embrace counterterrorism immediately, in recent years it has begun to. We now see a dedicated Office of Counterterrorism, a budget of over $500 million annually to implement the UN's global counterterrorism strategy, and a plethora of sanction regimes limiting who can and can't be engaged with. This has led some analysts, full disclosure, I am one of these, noting that the 4th pillar of counterterrorism is emerging at the United Nations, hence the framing of today's session. We've seen some really powerful critiques of this embrace of counterterrorism by the UN from the peace-building, human rights, humanitarian, gender, peace and security communities, exposing the harm that securitized counterterrorism and CVE approaches have done to their ability to build, make and keep peace, to promote and protect human rights, to deliver humanitarian aid and to achieve gender equality. Some have worried that this embrace of counterterrorism is leading the DNA of the UN to mutate in ways that are highly consequential, but not enough scrutiny. So today's session asks whether these compromises the UN has struck in coexisting with the war on terror will come to threaten its ability to uphold its charter. How will this shift affect the UN and the people it serves? What should be done in response? So in the context of the Global Governance Forum, which has been happening over the last few days, and the conversations around the UN's 75th birthday, we want to think really about the future we want to see when it comes to the UN counterterrorism. So that's the framing. Today's session will be recorded, and we'll be using a new online tool. I love new online tools, called Miro. It's basically an online whiteboard that will allow us to record the suggestions made in a place for us all to see as they're being made. Our colleague who is giving us technical support for this session will put the link in the chat so you can open it up, and she will also have it as a screen share so you can see these comments being recorded. So to start us off, let me turn to Professor Ní Uaillinn. Fionnuala, thank you so much for joining. So I wanted to ask you, as we approach the 75th anniversary of the United Nations under the banner, "The Future We Want, the UN We Need," it'd be great to hear from you after your 3 years as Special Rapporteur. In terms of your mandate, do we have the UN right now that we need? And if not, what needs to happen to get the future we want?
Thanks, and I'm really glad to join this conversation. I wish it were in person. So I think the UN we have right now is a UN that is significantly distorted by the gargantuan growth of counterterrorism structures. It's a UN in which states' interests in securitization as opposed to security have come to dominate multilateral engagement and funding within the UN system. And we have a UN in which, of course, there's always been this historic tension between New York and Geneva, but where the drive of securitization out of New York, primarily through the wagon of terrorism, but increasingly through the wagon of extremism and violent extremism, is really threatening to lopside the kind of the intrinsic, not always comfortable, always negotiated balances that were baked in when the UN was created. So there's a real structural problem, and it's one that's grown very quickly. The Office of Counterterrorism is only 2 years old, but it has expanded exponentially. And of course, we have a long-standing and well-entrenched security apparatus out of the Security Council through the Counterterrorism Committee, the UN CTED, which supports it. And maybe also just to say, one of the things that we often fail to grasp is that UN we have today, that securitized, security-focused UN, has all of these tentacles reaching out to other entities that are doing work for it. So we've had a proliferation of new counterterrorism entities that don't sit on any chart of the UN system that you would recognize, but have this organic relationship with the norm setting, the over securitization that we're seeing. So that's the UN we have. It's a UN in need, I think, of an enormous rethink and recalibration. And we're coming up to the anniversary of 9/11, 20 years on. This is a really good time for us to be having this conversation as we celebrate 75 years. What we do about it is a more challenging question. And so if you want, Jordan, I'm happy to throw out some ideas about that, or you could come back to me on ideas about how we fix it, if that.
Please throw those ideas out straight away.
So I think the first thing we need to do is this sort of, and it's a kind of at a macro or meta level, which is we really have to reframe the nature of the debate around security and securitization. We need to shift this discourse that has become sort of hardwired into UN systems, which is that counterterrorism is the solution to every problem. It's the solution to women's security. It's the solution. So the first thing we got to do is shift discourses within the UN system and without the UN system. And that involves having key actors, which includes the Secretary General, it includes key individuals talking differently about security, talking differently about the problems that produce violence, and coming to a shared, more textured, nuanced, and human rights, peace, and human security-led approach. So discourse change is the first. The second thing we need is we need a profound institutional rebalancing of the security architecture that has sort of flourished in the last 2 decades, but particularly in the last 3 years. The UNCT architecture needs like an autumn pruning. It needs to be cut right back. Because there is a place for terrorism regulation, but it's a much smaller place. So that also includes looking at the large sums of money that are currently being poured into capacity building to bloat the security sectors in places like Mali and the Sahel and other places. Those are not the places we need to be growing capacity. We need to be growing the muscle reflexes of democracy and participation in civil society in those other places. The third thing we need as we kind of think about really dismantling or pruning back the security architecture is in the short to medium term, we need a serious human rights watchdog within the architecture. My role as a part-time special rapporteur with a full-time job as a law professor is not a solution to the oversight we need of these hundreds of programs. In the area of PVE alone, we have over 300 programs running out of this system, not to speak of all the national. So we need concentrated, empowered, whether it's an ombudsman or review, but a centralized independent office in the system that watches, that guards those doing this work. Fourth, we need an end to the era of Security Council, legislative Security Council resolutions. The Security Council is using counterterrorism, in my view, in a way that really upsets the delicate balance of the Charter. The Security Council is not a legislature for the world. And in the area of counterterrorism, it's legislating on biometrics, it's legislating on fair trial, I shouldn't say fair trial because they don't use those words. So we've got to really encourage states to see that their democracies need to be doing this work, their systems need to be doing this work, not the Security Council. We need finally a structure within the UN system that meaningfully, the security system that meaningfully engages independent civil society within the security architecture. One of the biggest challenges we face is that states are very happy to have hundreds of civil society organizations show up in Geneva. But as those on this call know, those of us who work in New York, it's an arid desert for civil society. The access points are really limited. But this is the place where the security policy that's set is affecting civil society space all over the world. It sets the stage for the downstream squeezing of human rights and squeezing of civil society space. So to remedy that, to make the decision makers aware and to really try to push back strongly against that securitization, we need space and official supported space for civil society. We're a long way from that. The Office of Counterterrorism promised us an office a couple of years ago. What we have so far is a draft of a paper, a consultation paper. We need these entities in New York to take civil society seriously and not just to bring them in and tick a box, we met you, but actually be able to have a process that is discursive and that enables civil society to impact the outcome. Because let's be clear, most of this stuff doesn't work if you don't engage civil society. It's profoundly counterproductive to secure and create human security in places where civil society is not part and parcel of the process. So that's at least my beginning wish list for reform in this area.
It's a pretty good wish list. I love the analogy of pruning. I got in a lot of trouble for over pruning my rose bush, but it has given us these flowers here that we have today. So it comes back stronger. Fionnuala, thank you so much for those suggestions and for those reflections. I want to turn to Mark next. Mark, you manage programs for a regional peacebuilding and advocacy organization in Southeast Asia. But I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on some of the impacts of the embrace of counterterrorism in the Philippines, where you live, and maybe some of the UN's role in this, just because a lot of the time we think about some of the macro level stuff, some of the UN headquarter policy developments, but we don't always reflect on what's happening and how this plays out downstream at a country level. So Mark, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. I think thank you for providing a space for me to join here, because I think it's important because a lot of the participants here, I think, are INGOs based in Europe and the US. I think it's important for them to understand how policies formed in the global arena impacts national policies. And in the Philippines, the role of the UN on forming the PCVE and CT counterterrorism work of the government has not only been substantial, but it has been critical in three ways. I think first one is intellectual and ideological, in a way that the UN bodies in the country have actively accompanied the government in crafting the National Action Plan on PCV, which was adopted last year, July. Secondly, as to financial and technical, UN and the various embassies have poured in vast financial resources, technical support on mainstreaming PCVE and capacity building of government actors, the security establishment, and even civil society. But third, political, wherein the UN official, a lot of UN officials, in fact, have claimed that the development of PCV and CD work in the country has been going well. So which provides political legitimacy to the process. So you could sense that in the Philippines, terrorism is back as a priority agenda, and UN has been key in this agenda setting. And despite the rising concerns and criticisms on PCVE, PCV is touted, I think, as a reminder, PCV is touted as a way of softening the government's approach to violent conflict and terrorism. It's supposed to holistically, allegedly, address factors of VE. However, in the case of the national setting, it appears that the UN has not been effective in pushing back and transforming the Philippine government's security agenda. And the PCV agenda has also not been successful in transforming that in two ways. There are two manifestations of that. The first one is when you look at the National Action Plan and PCVE of the country, it doesn't even have any clear set principles that firmly anchors the PCV strategy on human rights, conflict sensitivity, conflict prevention, peace building, conflict transformation. These are the key concepts that are found in a lot of UN frameworks in youth peace and security, women peace and security, the framework on prevention. You do not find this in the National Action Plan, wherein the various UN agencies are active in informing and accompanying the government. And this has been a core discussion point of ours in our dialogue with the government 3 days ago on the National Action Plan. And the problem with this is without clarity of principles, the focus and main approach is left to the majority or where the most earnest of the agencies, government agencies are. So that means that in the case of the Philippines, it's the military, it's the police, it's the intelligence establishment. So remember that in the civilian government of the Philippines, it's dominated right now by former military and police generals. There are 46 generals in civilian posts, 10 of which are in cabinet position. So it's not surprising that the approach is still predominantly military oriented. So the National Action Plan on PCVE therefore becomes a smokescreen to the resurgence of counterterrorism in the country. And the UN unwittingly and unfortunately has been instrumental in this rise. And part of the reason this is the passivity of the UN in the national level, wherein they don't want to be perceived as too political. They don't want to push the envelope because they say that they will be alienated from the host government, from the Philippine government. But unfortunately, in that process, they are alienated from the key mandate of the UN itself, which is prevention, promotion of and protection of human rights and peace building. But the second manifestation is the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 itself. If you've been following, it has been passed in July 2020, right at the peak of the pandemic. And in fact, this is such a controversial piece of legislation and so brutal that it's being now challenged by 35 petitions to the Supreme Court, which is testament of how disagreeable some of the provisions there. And even Pinula, and you can search that online, she has expressed a lot of reservations in her comments to the law, wherein we see that the new Anti-Terrorism Act, as it stands, is a threat not only to human rights, civic space, or freedom of dissent, but it's a threat to the normalization of the normalization process, the peace process, and even community security of a lot of marginalized actors, including youth, indigenous peoples, and women and activists in the country. So this is how deeply connected the UN body, the UN policies at the global level is within the framework, the development of the national policies in not just the Philippines. I think it's the same as many other countries as well.
Mark, thank you so much for those reflections. It is just so important that we continue to hear exactly how policies at headquarters do filter down, and what the impact is, and how that is influencing, you know, your work and the work of other civil society in this space. I wonder if you're able to just reflect, you know, in terms of maybe changing that in-country engagement on counterterrorism and on peace and security issues. And what would you recommend to the UN?
I think there are two big chunks of recommendations that we could provide. The first one is that the UN and its counterterrorism infrastructure, namely the UNOCT, the CTED, even the Security Council, has to understand the wider conflict prevention and peace building requirements in terror-affected communities. We're in situating it within and understanding how it is shaped by the various factors of conflict in the national level. Therefore, I think one way to do this is the UN should actively involve peace building, human rights, humanitarian organizations, and affected communities in crafting any national strategy on conflict prevention and transformation. We are not just consulted after policies are already formed, just like with the NAP PCVE, but we are that rather these stakeholders are at the start, during the implementation, and even in the post processes. So that the UN could have allies to check on member states, but also I think one other thing that could be done under this is that the UN should push back against member states that wish only to pick their favored, palatable, like-minded CSOs. You know, conflict transformation is about bridging divides and building conditions to encourage trust and cooperation. And the UN should encourage this by providing bridging state actors with civil society organizations, stakeholders that the government deems antagonistic to its position. But secondly is that the UN should ensure that human rights, peace building, and prevention should take precedence over all the other agendas. By putting the UN counterterrorism bodies and like CTED, OCT, and including the Global Counterterrorism Strategy and its programs funding under the broader framework of the UN peacebuilding architecture and the UN peacebuilding strategy. This includes, first, hiring more human rights advisors and peace development advisors to work with CTED, OCT, in national city bodies to ensure that all UN work on counterterrorism is conflict sensitive and upholds human rights. Second, expand funding and resources for activities and programs on the human rights pillar of the global counterterrorism strategy, but also integrating human rights and conflict sensitivity in the other three pillars of the global counterterrorism strategy before, during, and post all this CNPV related activities. And finally, setting up simple and secure procedure for feedback from communities and civil society for us to feedback and get redress for any harm that we are able to identify that CT and PCVA may harm ongoing peace building effort, peace processes, human security on the ground. And in sum, I think the UN that we want is not one that will be instrumentalized in reinforcing abuse, exclusion of already marginalized communities, in perpetuating impunity. These are the very drivers of violent conflict. The UN that we want is one that works with us in local actors in pushing for governments to become more accountable to its people and partner with affected communities and stakeholders towards achieving durable peace and human security. Those are the principles that the UN is founded on.
Mark, thank you so much for those recommendations and those reflections. And I want to just say a special thanks because it's past midnight where you are. And I am definitely not as coherent past midnight as you are. So thank you so much for kind of joining at such a late hour, but also just for sharing all those wonderful experiences. Great. Okay. Ali, I want to go next to you, and I want to ask you maybe just to reflect on some of your experiences working in the youth, peace and security space, but also on UN counterterrorism and securitization. What looking at the system, do you see as kind of the major flaws right now? You've had inside, outside experience, and what would you do to change things very practically?
Okay, thank you, Jordan. I mean, thank you also, Safer, for putting this session together. So I will start with the theme of 75th anniversary of the General Assembly, which is the future we want and the United Nations we need. So this kind of focuses on young people. I mean, it's about future. So looking from YPS and youth lens, is we need to recognize there's a big disparity between the future young people want and the current UN they have. And the UN must adapt to deliver the future young people want. So young people want peace. They want accountable and democratic governments. They want new economic development models that protect the future of their planet, which is evident in the protest and dissent of youth. And in short, young people want peace, justice, sustainable development, which are the three core pillars of the UN. But the UN we currently have is, as Fiona already explained, is building a fourth pillar, which exclusively aims to counter and prevent terrorism. There's significant investment attention into that new area, and this architecture, counterterrorism architecture, has a significant impact on young people's relationship with the UN and the multilateral system. Counterterrorism sees young people vulnerable to recruitment by terrorist armed groups. This stereotypes young people as a threat to be contained or a problem to be solved. These dangerous stereotypes, which associate young people with violence, fuel a policy panic on youth. This policy panic ignores the fact that most young people are not involved in violence, and policies driven by panic skew programmatic responses and priorities towards hard security approaches and silence, regulates, criminalize youth protest and dissent through closing and securitizing civic spaces and punishing young people. So what we see is the most recent addition to the UN counterterrorism architecture, the plan of action to prevent violent extremism, claimed to change this UN's counterterrorism approach to youth. But as Mark already explained, the PVE became a tool for some member states to blue-wash their abusive approaches or narrow the space for mediation, and also harm democracy through criminalization of dissenting youth voices. So PVE, as a cousin of counterterrorism, only expanded the scope of youth securitization. So what we see is that now UN youth empowerment programs, education, or even employment programs mutated into a kind of a counterterrorism tools. So UN implement these programs to prevent young people's radicalization leading to violent extremism. On the other hand, there's no conclusive evidence between youth involvement in violence and their unemployment, undereducation, or even political exclusion. But what we know, however, is that when national security agencies uses the concept of radicalization to prevent youth violence, we face a long list of harmful practices. This includes preemptive surveillance and control of young people and children in education institutions, labeling youth as potential extremists, which starts with mostly Muslim youth and then expands to youthful politics for social justice. And then we also see stifling the positive resilience of young people for peace. So large UN agencies, for example, UNESCO, UNDP now struggle to find ways to reconcile member states' prioritization of radicalization and violent extremism language and their core mandate. The premise of these terms, radicalization and violent extremism, contradicts with the very notion of youth empowerment. All these problems contribute to young people's mistrust and lack of confidence in the UN and the multilateral system at large. So, Jordan, if you don't mind, I will also maybe speak about what should UN do.
Please.
Okay. So, so to prevent these risks, these problems, UN first of all should refocus its strategy on peace, rights, and development. This can simply be done by appointing human rights and peace and development advisors with the mandate to safeguard UN peace, development, and human rights work from risk of securitization through counterterrorism. It's also worth noting that UN must do better to respond, acknowledge instrumentalization of gender language to do good counterterrorism. rather than fostering an approach that is based on a feminist based on a feminist perspective, which kind of UN needs to kind of craft a holistic intersectional approach to address relationship between gender, peace and security and counterterrorism. And this would transform patriarchal power structures, violent masculinities, and which fuel the reproduction of violent movements and counterproductive heavy-handed responses. And my second suggestion would be UN should mandate a regular internal learning exercise to troubleshoot harmful counterterrorism and PVE programming and assess its impact on peace, rights, and development. This regular whole of system exercise should identify bad practices and prevent their recurrence. The exercise should examine, among other things, proscription practices, which narrows the mediation, and the impact of sanctions on UN peace and humanitarian work. And and also, UN needs to look at the effect of CVE, PV within UN peace operations mandate in peacekeeping missions as well. So, so basically, UN needs a stronger review process for more thorough and inclusive and strategic reflection on the role of UN counterterrorism, including but not limited to biennial UNGC-TCS review processes. This is, I mean, we know that this is done for the UN peacebuilding architecture review, and so there is no reason why UN doesn't do this for counterterrorism. And my last point is bringing back to young people and youth from my PS lens, is that UN should shift its security approach from a reactive and remedial security responses to security responses informed by policy panic on youth, to a comprehensive youth-based violence prevention approaches that are both financially more efficient and more effective. So this means rather than investing in resources into to prevent risks represented by a small fraction of youth, to a multilateral system investing in the positive resilience of young people for peace. So this is all from my side, Jordan. Thank you.
Ali, thank you so much. I need a bigger screen to see all of these suggestions now on this whiteboard. So you know, it's been incredibly rich so far, and thank you really for those tangible suggestions, Ali. I think they're really important around internal learning, but also around that internal safeguarding. You know, we as civil society organizations are required to prove that we're being effective and not doing harm, and I think the same standards should apply in the counterterrorism sphere. Now I want to kind of segue over to Lorraine to talk about the work that you're doing, Lorraine, with UNOI, and Ali has been talking about some of the impacts on young people. But I wonder if you could maybe go in depth a little bit more on what you see as the risk with kind of a rising focus on counterterrorism and PVE at the UN for young peace builders and the youth peace and security agenda.
Thank you, Jordan. It's nice, it's exciting to be on this panel and to contribute to thinking the UN we want with this, my fellow panelists. And I want to start off by saying that I'm talking on behalf of the United Network of Young Peace Builders, and that's a network that's reaching out to about 12 million young people worldwide each year that are building peace mostly at the local level. And what it means is they're addressing the root causes of conflict, of violence, of violent extremism also. They're defending gender equality, they're defending climate justice, they're defending human rights. And I want to build on a number of the issues that have already been mentioned by my colleagues and also on their recommendations, while adding the specific perspective of that huge youth peace movement behind the UNOI network. And I want to talk about a really large systemic concern that actually you reminded us of in your introduction, Jordan, which is that the UN focus on counterterrorism has led an enormous amount of resources being directed to a small minority of young people, while a majority of young people is actually doing incredible peace work and is not being properly resourced, and instead is being antagonized by the counterterrorism focus. Can I remind us of what you said in your introduction, that there's over $500 million annually spent on the counterterrorism system in the UN? And can I also remind us then that about less than half of the world's youth-led civil society organization operates under $5,000 per year as their organizational turnover. That gives an idea of the discrepancy there. And this focus on counterterrorism has led, as was mentioned by Ali, but also in a number of reports to the Human Rights Council, to the instrumentalization of youth-led, or of civil society and youth-led civil society as well. The mutation of UN programs on peace building, on youth, into actually counterterrorism or PVE programs and funding schemes is pressuring youth-led organizations to focus on C or PVE as a way, the best way they can sometimes access resources. Doing that, and we've heard that from Mark, does not build peace locally. There's a clear lack of demonstrated effectiveness of that focus, and sometimes it even threatens, as in the case of the Philippines, peace talks and reconciliation processes. This instrumentalization that is changing the nature of civil society is also cutting youth-led organizations from the communities with which they've built trust. And we know in our network that ability to create trust with different society stakeholders, that ability to reach out to young people and to other community members, including those that don't often get a voice, is the biggest strength, or one of the biggest strengths of youth-led organizations. So we can imagine by harming that strength, the potential for peace that we're losing here. Finally, there's a number of examples also in our network where counterterrorism is an excuse to cut young people from their resources through silencing their work, through denying funding or support, through taking away registration rights and so on. And what this actually does is it disables them to legitimately dissent against their governments, to be civically active, but really to promote peace and nonviolence. And I want to bring back what Ali also said, that what we know from research in the field of youth, peace, and security is that a significant peace dividend can be obtained if the work of young peace builders and if youth, peace, and security is properly resourced, is properly supported, and that these initiatives are also protected in a large sense, meaning the rights, the human rights of young peace builders being protected, but also the space for them to operate being maintained and upheld. And I also have a number of recommendations to make, and I also want to build on the ones that have been made. In particular, I definitely second the recommendations made earlier with regards to pushing back on counterterrorism language that continues to antagonize a majority of the world's population, reducing it to victims or villains. And that would include to refrain from referring to counterterrorism in UN Security Council resolutions on young people, amongst other UN policy documents. The funding question is, of course, a top recommendation for me. The UN needs to fund the youth, peace, and security agenda, and some of the funding from the counterterrorism system should go into that to twist a bit that focus. This will mean refocusing funding schemes on peace, on human security approaches, as was suggested earlier, and very concretely, the UN should allocate a catch number of $1.8 billion to youth, peace, and security by 2025. That is $1 per young person in this planet, by the 10th anniversary of the first resolution on youth, peace, and security. My third recommendation would be that the UN really, that there's an opportunity for the UN to take a leading role in facilitating the connection between PVE, counterterrorism, human rights, and youth peace and security agendas. And by recognizing that youth peace and security does provide another way to look at the question of promoting and protecting human rights while countering terrorism, by focusing on the resilience, the positive resilience of young people, by focusing on the civic space available for exercising their work. And I do second the recommendations made earlier by Mark and by Fionnuala to establish stronger civil society engagement mechanisms in developing counterterrorism strategy both at the national and at the global level, and to explicitly include youth-led civil society in those mechanisms. Finally, my last recommendation would be to really bring a youth lens into the human rights agenda of the UN. At the moment, there isn't enough attention given to youth-specific issues in the different documents and frameworks and in the human rights community at large, even though the PVE agenda, for instance, is intimately a youth agenda with very clear human rights stakes. And so bringing a youth lens into the human rights agenda would mean prioritizing protection of rights of young people in their rights in the civic space for them to work, and broadening their engagement with human rights institutions and processes at the UN. And all panelists have mentioned the importance of appointing a watchdog for human rights or human rights advisors within the UN. And I think I would build on that, saying that these advisors, these watchdogs, should either be young persons themselves or be advised by youth in some way. Thanks.
Lorraine, thank you so much. I think you made some really, really great points. I want to maybe just pick up on what you said around linking with the human rights community in the human rights section of the UN system, and just maybe to point people on the webinar to Michelle Bachelet's recent remarks at the UN Counterterrorism Coordination Committee. They were a brilliant way of actually highlighting the links between peace and conflict, human rights, the closing of civic space, and really honing in on some of the stuff you were saying there as well, Lorraine. So I think, you know, there is leadership on this within the UN system, and there's some positive things happening. And I think, you know, as the speakers so far have highlighted, I think we just need a little bit more. So before I go to the next speaker, I want to say a big thank you to my colleague Tyler, who is, you see him as a little cursor going around the screen, but he's a real person, and he is doing a fantastic job of putting all these suggestions down on the whiteboard, and so I wanted to say a big thank you to Tyler for doing that. So final speaker, Attilia, thank you for joining us. So your organization have worked for a long time to try and explore why individuals are joining violent armed groups, and then trying to tailor strategies to make sure that responses are informed on those very specific reasons. You have a great body of work on research and on doing. Can you tell us from your experiences across the continent, you know, what's the UN doing wrong at the moment? Where do we need to shift, and what would you recommend?
Thanks a lot, Jordan, and thank you to Safer World, but also to the other speakers so far. Ordinarily, I would protest an African going last, but you've helped me. A lot of your contributions, in fact, feed into what I'm going to speak on. The first thing, reflecting essentially on what people have said so far, is that not all responses are solutions. So just because you have a problem that you're confronted with and you seek a laundry list of ways to respond to it, doesn't mean you're actually solving the problem. A lot of the work that we do at the Institute for Security Studies, which is to use research to actually inform better policies and practices, asks those tough questions around Why is it, for example, that a country like Niger, that has a median age of 14, has a high incidence of forms of violence that other countries within that region may not have, or where they have inherited a spillover from neighboring countries like Nigeria, Mali, or even to the north in Libya? Why is it that in Somalia, where there's an intractable conflict, that all efforts towards responding, whether it is the UN and AU mission in Somalia, AMISOM, operating for what I feel is an extremely long time with very limited results? Why do we have resurgence of violence in South Sudan that many do not necessarily describe as terrorism nor violent extremism, but if it had manifest anywhere else, would be regarded as that? And so for us, it's about asking those fundamental questions first, and then looking at what needs to be done. So not looking at the response and problematizing it first, but actually understanding the drivers. A number of years ago in the Horn of Africa, we did research in Somalia, Uganda, and Kenya, examining the reasons why people are joining violent extremist groups or groups regarded as terror groups. At the time, what a lot of people said was that the primary motivator would be religion. In the range of interviews that we did across communities and including members of violent extremist groups, religion came up fifth as a motivator. In fact, for a lot of people, issues related to governance, marginalization, whether young people or women who themselves felt the need to support violent groups that were, for them, serving an interest in responding to government repression. It was corruption. It was issues of limited access to resources. So having identified those issues and looking into the Lake Chad Basin in West Africa, where we've done similar research in Nigeria, Niger, Mali, and Cameroon, we find that the key issues that people are confronted with need to be addressed. Before you counter terrorism, you ought to counter the issues that are frustrating people in those communities. We need good governance. Human rights is a key and fundamental issue across those regions, where people feel that the state itself is repressing those communities, but that they have no protection nor protection mechanisms. It also means looking at what it is that has marginalized a largely youthful continent and largely youthful populations, where there are no opportunities, economic or otherwise, where the education sector is unable to absorb those very young people. Some of the groups in which they find themselves, where they find community, become, unfortunately, these large violent extremist groups that are cropping up across the various regions, whether it's in the Sahel, in the Lake Chad Basin, the Horn of Africa, or increasingly in the coastal states of West Africa. And so having said that and having framed that as my point of departure, I then go to what's the UN perhaps doing wrong? The UN, and when I say the UN, I'm not speaking only about the UN offices and executive directorates. I'm also speaking about member states that feed into the system of the UN. They're looking at the manifestation of these frustrations, the violence, and seeking to address that. A lot of the responses have been militaristic, even where they are couched in rule of law, human rights-based language. The reality is, on the ground, they are seen as a perpetuation of further state repression. And unfortunately, that means it feeds into continuing conflicts and continuing stresses in those regions. So perhaps, and this might come almost left field, if I can put it that way, if I say the people in Niger are struggling with access to education, water, and other resources, counterterrorism, whether you call it that or call it something else, actually means providing that society with those basic goods. It's ensuring that young people in that society who make up the majority find better opportunities than the ones that are presented before them. It means rethinking what it means to counter terrorism and actually be able to prevent it. It's going back to the fundamental pillars of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, if I may, and looking at the human rights pillar on the one hand, but also looking at responding to the conditions conducive to violence. and understanding that the conditions conducive to violence are not what people thought they may have been, that in fact, they are the issues around the frustrations that society has that need to be addressed. And so, and I know I've kind of gone all over the place with this, but I'm inspired by Tyler because that's exactly what he's doing. And I think some of my last points, if I may, Jordan, with just 1 minute, is then to reflect on what structures need to be there or what structures don't need to be there. At the moment, I feel that the UN has sufficient structures in place. I've heard recommendations around including monitors, so to speak. And my argument is often that that ought to come at the national and regional level, and that ought to then feed upwards into the UN system, not the other way around. We have seen what happens when ultra-national positions are superimposed on the state. And it's not that the UN has no good intentions. It is that when you do not reside in that space, you may not have the adequate information in order to craft the right responses. Whether it's what's happening in the Philippines at the moment, the intractable conflict in Somalia, or the ongoing issues in Yemen and Syria, ultimately, the people in those societies are actually the ones that are able to tell you what's wrong and then be able to shape those solutions. So the UN system and its structures as they currently are fine. But where is it particularly going wrong? And I'll end here, Jordan. When the United Nations was established 75 years ago as an institution that would promote and enhance international peace and security, it was perhaps a dream that countries would do so in the interests of other countries, that national interest would not dictate the movements in advancing international peace and security. So for me, when we think about the structures of the UN, perhaps the more democratic institutions of the UN ought to be the ones that deal with issues related to counterterrorism. I say more democratic because I do not think the UN Security Council is the most democratic of the institutions of the UN. And yet it is the one that through a quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative function has begun to enact essentially what we know as the current UN response to violent extremism and terrorism, when in fact there are more institutions within the UN, far more democratic, that ought to be leading the initiatives globally around how do we deal with the threat of terrorism. Thank you, Jordan. I took about 2 minutes more than you said I should have.
And you deserved it. It was fantastic. Thank you so much. You know, I think one thing that just is so important that you acknowledged and kind of shared on is this kind of, there is sometimes within the UN system, but within all of maybe our organizations, this idea that we're the best place to respond and that we need to remain relevant by responding. But there are times when, you know, being involved in certain processes like Mark has shown, actually, you know, might harm our relevance. If we are actually supporting something that is being weaponized and used in a way that is not the most constructive. So I think that acknowledgement, I think, is just really, really important for us all. I see that there are a couple of question and answer. There's a couple of questions in the chat box. You can raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question rather than typing it. I think that's a much more personal thing to do, and seeing some of those who are online as attendees, I know that there will be many people wanting to speak. So raise your hand if you have a question that you'd like to ask. In the meantime, I maybe will just we'll go for the first question from Nicholas Miller from ICNL, which was directed to Fionnuala. Nick's question was about the discussion of the creation of a new office of civil society engagement, and just wanted to hear from you, from your reflection working within the system or around the system. Would this help in the CT context, or would it actually could it actually hinder certain process of civil society inclusion? So maybe, Fionnuala, if you were able to just answer that, we then have 20 minutes for other people to raise their hands and make comments or ask questions.
Sure. So I would say to Nicholas that positioned question from ICNL, which I think has been working really diligently to try to open up this space. What I would say is, yes, I'm all for more, and I don't think that we should be saying no to any initiative that opens up space a little more. It has concerned me greatly that, for example, we had an Undersecretary General role created in the counterterrorism space. But for example, we have an Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. So the sort of relative status of these positions matters. It matters who holds them. And it matters that we don't have the kind of status positions for civil society that signal an institutional and organizational commitment to mainstreaming. So that idea of creating and carving out a role, which is consistent with the Stand Up for Human Rights campaign that the Secretary General has endorsed, I think is a useful way. But it's not enough. It's like talking about gender mainstreaming, whether we should have gender mainstreaming or do you need specialized? You need both. You need these overarching entities, and then in the specific areas, you will still need experts and space created in the specific area to deliver the outcomes. And I think that is as true of counterterrorism as it is of anywhere else. And just to add, Nicholas also asked a question about budgets and there's been a lot of discussion about budgets, but I mean, and my answer was a little, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but true. States who say they care for human rights have to pay for human rights. States who are prepared to pay for counterterrorism, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, put their money where their mouth is. And so it is not good enough anymore that our allies who say that they are on our side will not fund the work that will enable the kind of things they say they support. So I think we have to be hard on our friends right now, because unless they're prepared to write the checks, we will be at a structural disadvantage indefinitely.
Fionnuala, thank you so much. I wonder if anyone else or from the panel would like to just respond or build on any of those points. And if anyone from the floor would like to make a comment. I see a hand that's gone up from the panelists. Attilia, over to you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Jordan. There's something you said now, Fionnuala, which I think needs to be stressed as much as possible. So I'm basically going to re-stress it for you as well, which is this issue around what areas of work countries want to fund, and then they put their money essentially where their mouths are, whether it is out of good intentions or otherwise. That's a conversation, I believe, for another day. And those areas that perhaps then lose out as a result of that. And I think it goes to the heart of Nicholas's question, which is where essentially they are, and in this case, counterterrorism has found a nice space in which, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Russia, whether it's the United States previously, wanting to put as much of their resources towards counterterrorism, but not dedicating as much, and not just to human rights alone, but to the range of other issues that the United Nations needs to focus on. And it made me reflect on research we did a few years ago in refugee camps in Ethiopia with communities from South Sudan and Somalia around community perceptions of violent extremism. And it was interesting then looking at the ways in which, one, they actually saw the investment, I mean financial investment, in the responses to the conflicts within their societies through the lens of violent extremism. But interestingly, and this is perhaps an aside, interestingly, the level of violence that had been perpetrated in South Sudan, for example, at the time, this was about 3 years ago, was higher then than in Somalia. However, in South Sudan, there was no definitive way of describing violent extremism, where Somalia, having had issues of terrorism and violent extremism for years, dialectically, there were over 28 ways of describing it. And there were also 28 ways of describing the way in which the state simply was unable to handle issues related to violent extremism. So it's financial resources on the one hand, but I think it's also a lot in terms of human and intellectual resources that are simply not placed on other areas that we need to be exploring. And one of the key recommendations, and I'll end here, was actually that a lot of the programming that was done, because the one community did not perceive that violence as terrorism or violent extremism, all the community programming that was done there was not labeled as such, and it was better received. The community programming that was being done in the east of Ethiopia, in Jijiga refugee camp and nearby, which was termed as violent extremism or countering terrorism initiatives, was not well received by the refugee community, because their question was, why do you think we are the ones that need to be, that need this issue addressed, when in fact we have fled violent extremism and have fled terrorism? Why are we the people that must hear about this? We know it intimately and we want no part in it.
I mean, I think those, you know, just further stressing those points are really, really important. And, you know, I think Mark has his hand up next, and I'm sure that there's going to be more stressing of these points. Mark, over to you.
I want to extend Fiula's point even further, that it's not just about funding our ally member states who say that they are allies of human rights, to fund human rights, but those who say are champions of peace building and conflict prevention should stop reframing their funding to PCVE, because I think we need to confront how problematic that framing is, because for two main things. There's a lot of critique, but we see two things in the Philippines. The first one is it's a catch-all phrase, basically, or a term that puts in different kinds of conflict into one basket. Again, us forgetting the differences of factors and dynamics between these conflicts. But secondly is the reframing of PCV reframes the problem as a problem of non-state actors and takes away any discussions about the role of the state, the role of state actors, and structural conditions that brings about a conflict. So there is no problem with the language of peace building that has been built from the experience of the grassroots conflict transformation language, tools on conflict analysis, conflict sensitivity. Those are things that were iteratively built from the experiences of grassroots peace builders and community organizers. And we should keep the course in insisting that that language, that framework is something that works. And that should be a challenge even for civil society, I think, not to adopt that language, or even when we adopt that language, we should insist that yes, that is only probably for reporting, but still keep on engaging donors and embassies and allied organizations that eventually that has to stop. That language is not useful, is not sensitive, and does not reflect the realities of conflict on the ground.
Mark, I think that, you know, incredibly important points, and I think you know, it's worth acknowledging that different parts of the UN system have acknowledged this as well. They have understood the challenge that the PV framing then brings later down the line on how you're addressing root causes of conflict and drivers of individuals joining violent groups. So I think these things have been acknowledged at some level, but not everywhere. And I think this is a real challenge with the kind of the overall bureaucracy and the different parts of the organization working often at cross purposes. I can't believe that there's no one in this distinguished group of attendees that doesn't want to say something. So I think it's probably because you're feeling quite overwhelmed with how great the panelists were. That could be my only guess. I'll hand over to Ali maybe to make a comment before anyone else wants to chime in. Ali, over to you.
Thank you, Jordan. I mean, so we are kind of discussing about the root causes. I mean, Ottilia kind of particularly got into that subject, is that the way we start seeing what are the underlying causes of extremism in the from the perspective of communities. I mean, it's very easy to name by governments or international organizations to name any sort of violence as extremist or terrorist form of violence. And that's what we are talking about. But bringing back, I mean, I wanna just reflect from what we hear from young people. Is the missing piece study said it very clearly. When we listen to the young people, they speak about the violence of exclusion. They are talking about exclusion as a sort of a form of violence, and that study is like basically formulated like the main thrust of that study is saying that until we address the violence of exclusion, we won't be able to deal with the problem of terrorism. So, I mean, so what we need to see in this space, I think, is that the term violence has been abused very much, and I think Ottilia was really speaking about this, and I think counterterrorism discourse somehow became very easy to not to speak about state violence. And until we start opening up that space, and which is the space young people occupy in dissent, this is about reprisals and how they are crushing dissent, but it's also about young people speak about the socioeconomic rights. And until we create that space for young people to actually raise their voices, we won't be able to deal with the problem of extremism or terrorism either.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. I mean, it's really important point to raise, and the brilliant work from the missing piece, Youth, Peace and Security Progress Study, highlighting the violence of exclusion, and that came directly from the voices of young people from all around the world that were consulted for that study, and I think it's really important to flag. Fionnuala, I saw you had your hand up, and I also think Lorraine wanted to chime in. There is another question afterwards from Sangeeta from Human Security Collective. Maybe Fionnuala, if you wanted to touch on this. Can you really talk about reforming UN counterterrorism without talking about reforming the UN itself? So I think getting maybe a little bit to some member state politics, Sangeeta, I imply. Fionnuala, over to you.
Yeah, no, I just want to underscore Ali's comments about just the kind of the ways in which sort of what's seen as the problem, the framing of the problem and the framing of the solution are so profoundly mismatched with what is experienced on the ground. And that also, I think, speaks to the kind of distance from New York to the ground and the lack of engagement with the experience on the ground in New York. So if there's one practical thing, it seems to me, that comes out of particularly these side events to the civil society organizations who are listening, is that actually engaging in these spaces is really important. It's really important that those messages are heard. And it's really important that Mark and others speak to what's happening precisely in the national spaces, so that we can't have this sort of veil of ignorance in New York that pretends as if, for example, the Sahel is working, that securitization in the Sahel is working, when, as my grandmother would say, the dogs in the street know that it's not working, and it's precisely not working because of this sort of securitization, bloating of the security sector, lack of attention to economic, social rights, the lack of attention to fundamental discrimination and patterns of political exclusion that have been much older than the current wave of violence. So those are things that we have to remind them. I will accept, I mean, there's a bigger reform agenda here. There's a structure that is elitist, that's closed, but it is the only structure we have. The one thing I will say in the counterterrorism space is that, sometimes you can only bite off certain pieces of a big thing in order to get at the big thing. And it seems to me that the egregiousness of so much of what's happening in the counterterrorism space actually exposes those broader geopolitical kind of problems in a way that may lend themselves to opening that up. Because securitization is enabling and supporting exactly those trends that make the dysfunction of the organization so opportunistic for certain states. Why is it that states are embracing counterterrorism? So many authoritarian populist states are doing so precisely because the language of terrorism allows them to define whomever they choose in that box, and thereby continue to consolidate their own power and exclusionary structures. So I do think, though, that we have an opportunity to name that. It is, in some sense, so revealed at the moment. And I think there's I see it in my own work as special rapporteur, an increasing kind of common language being shared by many of us, those of us who work on youth, those of us who work on gender, those who work in humanitarian action, those who work in security. We are all seeing the same thing, and we're all starting to say the same thing. And even though we feel like we're losing, because I sort of feel like lots of days we feel like we're losing, our voices are starting to coalesce in a way around this that I think could be extremely powerful.
Vanilla, I feel a lot like we're losing some days, but on days like this, I feel positive because of everything you're saying, but everything all the panelists are saying and the analysis that's coming through. And I think that it's a palpable moment where the analysis of human rights organizations and peace building organizations and youth focused organizations and those working on gender, peace and security and humanitarian organizations is starting to coalesce and come together. And that could be quite a formidable thing. Lorraine, you had your hand up, and then over to Ottilia afterwards.
Thanks, Jordan. I struggled to get that hand up. Yeah, I just want to continue reflecting on some of the comments that have been made by Ali and by Fionnuala also with regards to the violence of exclusion faced by, experienced by young people, that sometimes indeed, because it comes from the poor governance, because of the corruption, the socioeconomic exclusions they're facing does push into violent extremism. But what the missing piece really told us is that in the majority of times it does not, and that despite of these different exclusions experienced, young people do so much that actually does prevent violence and does prevent violent extremism. And this really, I think, brings up the question of evidence that the progress study, the missing piece, has given us, that there's so much potential in investing in that upside represented by young peace builders, while on the contrary, in the field of counterterrorism, research shows the lack of evidence that the measures used are effective and that there isn't, the coherence isn't there. So I think, yeah, it's just really about time that the investment matches the evidence. Thanks.
Thanks, Lorraine. In the interest of time, I'm going to shoot straight over to you, Ottilia.
Thanks, Jordan. This is really in response to the question that Sangeeta posed around essentially reforming the whole system. When I spoke earlier, I did state, I didn't allude to it, I stated quite clearly that I do not think the UN Security Council ought to be the body, particularly as it relates to counterterrorism, that essentially quasi-legislates, so to speak, because we've actually seen what a primary security lens has done in pushing the hope that a war can create peace, and we know that it can't. I also just wanted to add on this note, as we're reflecting on 75 years of the UN, at the moment, the UN Security Council's permanent 5 members, have essentially been there since the UN was established. As a person that comes from 2 former colonies of the United Kingdom, and both African colonies of the United Kingdom, that do not have a permanent representation at the UN Security Council, recognizing also that the majority of the resolutions out of the Council, particularly as they relate to terrorism or situations in which violent extremism has manifested, are African situations. For me, it goes without saying. It goes without saying that the decisions that need to be made around actioning UN counterterrorism, for example, should not be made with the exclusion of the situations or the countries that are directly affected by terrorism in this way. Last year, colleagues of mine, Gustavo de Carvalho and Priyal Singh, wrote a report on essentially questioning, Africa being, whether it's at the table or on the menu of the UN Security Council. And I think it's a really important question, because we can have this conversation, but for as long as the UN Security Council does not represent the situations that are being dealt with, we will keep having the same conversation. So yes, goes without saying, vote for reform of the UN, but pragmatically, I hear what Finola has said, which is this is the system that we have, and we need to find innovative ways now as we work towards reform to be able to ensure, at the very least, some form of democratization of the UN Security Council. If it means pushing against a veto power in respect of particular excesses of violence, then let that be so. But I think there has to be initiatives that are in the short term that are done to be able to address the imbalance within the UN Security Council, and as a result, the imbalance in advancing global peace and security.
Attilia, exactly what Letta says in the chat. I think an incredibly important comment, and something that I think not many people on this call would disagree with. I think that you'd probably find nobody disagreeing with that. We've got a couple of minutes left. I saw Mr. Simpson raised his hand. So Graham, over to you if you wanted to make a comment.
Thanks. I think I'm muted by you. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's
Okay.
great power that we get to unmute you.
So I'm now unmuted. You can hear me now. Thanks for the opportunity. I just want to sort of emphasize one issue, which is I'm not sure this is on topic in that it's not narrowly focused specifically on the UN, but it is a slightly broader concern, and that is that I think we make a terrible error by evaluating the magnitude of investment in the counterterrorism and CVE discourse only by what's being spent within the UN on this, and we don't see the billions of dollars that have been spent in the last decades in the war on terror. Because I do think what it does is it dwarfs even further where the investment is made in positive peace, in development, in the resilience of young people and all of these issues. But the reason this is so important is because I think it's reflective of a much broader pollution of this conversation. I remember listening to young people in the regional consultation for the Progress Study in Youth, Peace and Security in Central America and the Caribbean, saying if the discourse is about counterterrorism and CVE, then you completely play to a geopolitics that excludes us, that doesn't recognize the underlying causes and the need to address the underlying causes of violence in our lives and the patterns of violence in our lives. And in fact, the only response that is detectable to some of those young people is the extent to which suddenly all protest and dissent, all activities of young people is treated as threatening and as potentially as terrorism. And so the sort of repressive state responses to that I think Ali referred to, and the understanding of the fact that most young people in the Progress Study said they were much more frightened of their governments than they were of terrorist groups, I think speaks volumes to the way in which this agenda is skewing our priorities. And the last thing I want to say about that is that I think we also need to be quite, and by the way, at the heart of this is that I think that the emphasis that is placed on assessing impact of measuring the bang for buck on the investments in development and in peace building is simply not matched by any commitment to assessing the impact of the dollars spent on counterterrorism, the war on terror, CVE, etc., etc. There is no assessment, least of all of the extent to which some of these investments are actively counterproductive, that they actually do more to reinforce the very issues that they supposedly are addressing. And the last thing I want to say about this is that the pervasive effect of the securitization discourse is one that I think we need to be very careful of. I think that it relates to the grave danger that when we think about education, or when we think about jobs, or when we think about development goals, we stop seeing them as speaking to aspirations and inclusion of young people. We stop seeing them as being about the rights discourse that we should be investing in and supporting. And we start seeing them only in ways that they haven't proven themselves to be, as means of fending off the participation in violent extremism, which is in any event the purview of only tiny proportions of the young people. So this is a very blunt instrument, and I feel like we aren't doing enough to point that out and to demonstrate the alternative avenues and reasons for investment in some of these things, because I think we pollute our education and our development conversations by treating them as manifestations of a counterterrorism or a CVE discourse.
Graham, thank you so much. I always get excited when you raise your hand, and your intervention did not disappoint. We're a little over time. I want to give the floor to Fanula. She has her hand up before we finish. I also just want to acknowledge Letta's question in the Q&A around how much money being spent globally on PCV, and I think maybe that is something for us to all follow up on. But maybe we don't have the time to answer it now. But Fanula, over to you.
Yeah, I just really want to echo and concur with Graham's really prescient observations about, while this is a conversation focused on the UN, it is organically linked to these massive investments in the global war on terror at regional, national level. It has spawned an architecture both regionally and nationally in many systems. It is a mammoth, and that mammoth is one that is self-affirming, self-reproducing, and actually sort of propagating itself. And I think one of the things for us to be aware of is that because precisely these questions on monitoring evaluation have been asked, and we do see the emergence of a language around monitoring and evaluation in the counterterrorism arena at the UN. But I caution us all to be aware that it is not monitoring and evaluation of the kind that mainstreams human rights, that is really focused on negative effects. And so I just think one of the things we often think about is that looks very technical, but in fact it's really important that we are all engaged in what look like those technical spaces, because they are the ones that facilitate the enablement and the entrenchment of these discourses, because in fact they have a reason to prove to them, they want to claim that they work, and so the system will gear up to defend itself, and we have to be acutely aware of those dangers at the present moment.
Fanula, I think that's a wonderful place for us to end. I want to thank everyone for joining us, for some on a Friday evening, for some on a Friday night, for everyone on a Friday 6 months into a lot of video calls, and so I want to thank you all for taking the time. It was a real pleasure to be on such a brilliant panel, to be surrounded by activists and experts and leaders from 4 different continents, with a diverse range of work that they're doing. And I think, I mean, according to the Somali definition of youth, I think almost all of our panelists were youth. So I know the Somali definition changes depending on who you speak to. That's what my colleagues and friends tell me. But I think that's fantastic to see such a diverse panel. So thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for being here. And there will be a recording of this, because so much great stuff was being shared that I think you probably all want to check back in to double check that you didn't miss anything. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.